No. Hey y'all, my name is Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today, and for this video we are going to be doing a recent reads. Alright, before I get into anything bookish, make sure you hit like and subscribe down below, as well as tell me in the comments how many books have you DNF'd in the last month. So hey, it's been a minute since I've done a recent reads. Usually, if I have more than 5 books for the month that I didn't read for a specific video, I will do a monthly wrap-up, but I did not have enough for those in April. Even though I did totally random TBR, actually a lot of the books I read ended up working out for different videos, which was fantastic. However, that kind of means this recent reads is basically a May wrap-up with a little bit of April in it. Unfortunately, since this is a recent read rather than a wrap-up, I don't have a stat portion, but if you are interested in my stats and I don't post a wrap-up, I do usually include those in my journaling videos every month, so here's just a little heads up about that if you really enjoy stats. Keeping it nice and simple, I figured let's just organize this based on rating. Unfortunately, I did have 2 DNFs within the last 2 months. Thistlefoot by gennarose, nethercott. This is basically a retelling of Baba Yaga, but specifically we are following the 2 youngest living descendants of Baba Yaga, who recently have inherited the house on chicken legs. We have our 2 main characters, 𝗖ście and Bellatine. Each of them have these very funky abilities, and apparently in this world, a building that has some sort of anthropomorphized aspect to it isn't very unusual. I was really intrigued by this whenever I got it from Book of the Month because I hadn't read a Baba Yaga retelling, but unfortunately for me, this just did not work. I think my favorite chapters were actually those through the perspective of the house itself. I hated 𝗖ście. I hated how he treated his sister. I hated how he treated everybody else around him also. I really couldn't get a feel on like what magic was in this world, and I didn't understand why there were these multiple different plots taking place. We have the main story in which these 2 siblings have inherited the house. At the same time, we have the perspective of the house occasionally, or flashbacks to the original Baba Yaga and seeing the initial story and how this house came to be. Plus, there was some sort of a villainous character who we would occasionally see from. None of those things really flowed together very well, so between that and then the fact that I absolutely detested 𝗖ście, I ended up DNFing this. I'm still bummed about it, but yeah, this is now sitting in my unhaul pile. The other book I recently DNF'd was Tiny Imperfections by Allie and asha youmans. I picked this up for Smut Den, which I have a reading vlog for, and I'll put a link to that in the cards. I believe I had spun yellow font on the cover, and so this was like the one book I had which had a yellow font, and I could get the audiobook at that exact moment. So I started into it while I was painting the master bedroom in my new house. I got about an hour in. I really don't even remember the summary for this book. The reason I ended up putting this down was because I hated the fact that the main character's entire backstory was given to us in this giant info dump that was put inside of a story where she is telling us about how she and her best friend came to be best friends. I just did not like how that was written out. There's 300 more pages. Why are you giving us just everything right up front? Take a little bit of time to build on that stuff. Not to mention, seeing as how she's the admissions officer for a very prestigious private school, she has to deal with many prestigious, snotty people. And what was really strange was she's complaining about those people, but the writing of this character made her seem like one of those people at the same time. It just seemed a little unself-aware. Between those 2 things, I just immediately lost interest and returned to the library book really quickly. Speaking of library books, I also read Catherine House by Elisabeth Thomas. Thank God I got this from the library because I was not a fan. I've heard so many reviews for this book, and they are all very different in rating. I picked this up for the Full Moon Book Club, and unfortunately, this just didn't work for me. In this book, we're supposed to be following this character, Inez, who has gotten into Catherine House, this very prestigious free college that you go to for 3 years. However, you are completely isolated from the outside world. No newspapers, no TV, no phones, nothing. And while there, Inez starts to find out some of the darker secrets going on at Catherine House. That sort of setup automatically makes you think dark academia. I do believe the dark academia vibes were the best part of this book because everything else was so boring. Nothing happens in this. Nothing at all. And that's coming from somebody who likes boring books. It's funny because like I do like atmospheric stories. I love atmospheric stories actually. It's something else apart from just atmosphere. I can't only have the aesthetic of the story and be engaged. Our main character Inez was fine, but I never really felt particularly strong about her in any regard. She sort of slacks off. Eventually she kind of tries, and then the mystery element was really underwhelming. I was so hopeful that we were gonna have lots of twists and turns, that it was gonna be almost a bit culty, because I was starting to get some cultish vibes. No, not at all. By the end of the book, when I finished this audio, I was mad. I was mad that I pushed through this much of a book for that sort of an ending. Granted, I will admit, part of my feelings for this might be related to the fact that I literally was finishing the audiobook when I got into a car accident, so poor association. My Cawpile ratings still showcase that this was a 2-star. I'll give it the dark academia vibes. That is it. This was not for me, and thank God I did not go out and buy it. Continuing off of that, other books that I was unfortunately disappointed in. For You and No One Else by Roni Loren. And this one hurts because this is the final book in the Say Everything romance series, which I have loved. I gave the first 2 books in this series 5 stars. I also read this for Smut Den, but I read it with Michelle. It was very entertaining to share thoughts on this, because there were some interesting moments in the story. Starting out in this book, we are originally following Eliza, who is a therapist. However, she is a little addicted to social media, a little obsessed with appearances, and after a date from hell, she ends up unfortunately having a very embarrassing video shared online, and then it is linked to her therapist's YouTube channel. Recently, she has befriended her office neighbor, Beckham, and he ends up challenging her to take 6 months, completely remove herself from social media, from dating apps. Hopefully she can kind of start to live in the real world a little bit more, and perhaps the aftermath of the video will have passed by. At the same time, we're following Beckham, who is a little bit of a social recluse. He doesn't like social media at all. He's actually in cybersecurity, so he constantly talks about the fact that he sort of understands how easy it is for personal information to be shared via social media, and that's why he hides away from it. And right here, right now, I want to talk about the fact that it is so weird that Beckham is exactly like Josh. I've talked about many a times that Gus in Beach Read, personality-wise, is just like my boyfriend. No, Beckham was so like him in appearance, in his outfits. It was scary. In his job, in his interests, it was weird. Little comments here and there would just reveal further similarities. However, there were a few differences. First off, Beckham has some religious trauma, which is an element in the story that I do want to bring up. Unfortunately, I don't think it was handled quite as well as I would have enjoyed. Roni Loren did a disservice by not diving into it more until the very end of the book, because I wanted more of that. I wanted to see more about it and learn more about Beckham's backstory, but we didn't really get it until after the 3rd act conflict. I really liked the start of this book. I liked the setup. I really enjoyed the fact that these two became friends very easily. However, right out of the get-go, there is a huge focus on physical attraction and lust. There's tons of sexual tension in this, which is great. I do love sexual tension, but I didn't feel like the chemistry between them really lived up to it. Meaning I wasn't nearly as invested in their relationship because it felt like a lot of it was purely lust-based. Then we get into a friends with benefits situation, which is unfortunate because I just don't like how it was handled in this book. And the irony is that there is a friends with benefits situation in the first book in this series that I did enjoy. While both characters were fully fleshed out, very well created, they had personalities that hopped off the page, they had backstories that really explained the way they acted in the book, I wasn't sold on them as a couple. We see how their previous experiences affect their outlook on relationships. With that, God, I was so exhausted by the constant back and forth that we see in Eliza's perspective. And then on the opposite side, Beckham has this mindset of he doesn't want a monogamous relationship, he doesn't believe in marriage. God, that mindset just felt so incredibly cliched, even if there was a different sort of background reason why he believed that thing. The final conflict you can also see coming from a mile away. And the final thing that really bugged me and probably brought this down in rating was the fact that in the epilogue, we see a receipt of Beckham going to get Eliza's name tattooed on his chest. No, I'm sorry. I don't think you should ever get anybody's name tattooed on you. That is very permanent. Very cringy. Did not enjoy. There were certain elements of this book that were really working for me, and there were others that really were not. So in the end, this came out to 3.5 stars. I am going to keep it on my shelves because it did have some strong moments. Again, it's so weird that Beckham is exactly like Josh to a scary degree. But this was a letdown, and I am sad. Next up, I continued a different series that is relating to the comic book reading vlog I recently did, so I'll put a link to that in the cards also. I continued the Miss Marvel series by G. Willow Wilson with volume 7, Damage Per Second, and I really enjoyed this one. I think by this point, the series has really hit its stride. Every single issue is fun. I think the authors have done a phenomenal job of making it so that every single volume actually feels like its own little story, and they build off one another very well. I also enjoy the fact that this series has dived into some heavier topics, particularly relating to the audience that this is mostly written for, which is young adults. And I loved the fact that there was a final issue in this which was focused solely on Bruno, who is currently in Wakanda. And first off, I love Bruno as a best friend character, but second off, I loved seeing him interacting with a different superhero because he's just as much a fangirl as Miss Marvel is. Absolutely adorable and hilarious. I gave this one 4 stars. Finally, in regards to series, I continued the Bright Falls series with Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail by Ashley Herring Blake. This was a surprise pickup thanks to the Smutden wheel, but wasn't complaining about it. I do not remember what I spun to get this. This one is continuing off of the previous book in the series, Delilah Green Doesn't Care, which I read sometime last year and I did really enjoy. Theoretically speaking, giving you a summary of this is kind of spoilery to the first book, but it's a romance series. In this series, we are following Astrid Parker, the stepsister to Delilah from the first book, and unfortunately, Astrid is slowly trying to put herself back together after the events of the first book. She is trying to move on and trying to get away from the leash that her mother has on her. She's recently agreed to be the head designer for the redoing of a giant mansion in their town, which is currently working as an inn, and this is going to be filmed by some sort of an HD TV thing, and she's really hoping that this will bring a ton of attention to her business and really kick her career off. Unfortunately for her, she is not expecting Jordan, who is the granddaughter of the owner of the inn, as well as the head carpenter. Jordan has been dealing with her own drama lately in her personal life and is sort of utilizing this as a kicking off point as well to possibly try and move on finally. However, this is definitely poor first impressions when Jordan ends up spilling coffee all over Astrid the day that shooting for this TV show is gonna start, and Astrid does not realize who Jordan is when she blows a gasket and screams at her. I will say this definitely held up to the first one. I think that Ashley Herring Blake does a phenomenal job with characters as well. Very well-rounded. They have very strong voices and personalities that mesh together very well, but also stand on their own. The dynamic between these two was really what initially drew me into the story, but the comedy of it is definitely what kept me invested. I wasn't really the biggest fan of Astrid in the first book, but by the end of this one, I really loved her. I really liked seeing the growth she went through. I loved the gay panic moments that we see from her. Those are fantastic, especially since she comes out later in life. Jordan was 100% my kind of woman. She was kind, she was sweet, she was absolutely hilarious. Definitely weird, a little bit of a mess, but she was recovering throughout the story, and that was something else I really enjoyed seeing. I just liked that we got to see both of these characters trying to heal and find a new happiness for each other, while at the same time slowly growing closer and closer. As friends, they were very funny and really sweet, but as a couple, they were steamy and adorable. I will say right here, right now, I'm not an HGTV girly. I've just never gotten the appeal. That element of the story didn't really hold my attention very well. There were some good scenes because of it that I really enjoyed seeing between the two characters, but apart from those, I could have done without it. It was nice and spicy also. I do think this is a really enjoyable time. I love the friend group that this series is following. I can't wait for Iris Kelly because she is absolutely my favorite of the group. So in the end, I gave this one 4 stars as well. Next up is a book that I read for my anticipated reading vlog, which unfortunately has gotten pushed back many a times, and I don't think it has come out yet when this video does. Hopefully it'll be out here soon. I read Happy Place by Emily Henry, which obviously it was an anticipated read. I was really excited going into this, particularly when I found out that it was a second chance romance. So in the story, we are following Harriet, and she is going on vacation with all of her friends. However, when she gets there, she realizes that her friends have dragged along her ex-fiance, Wynn. Problem is, Harriet and Wynn have not told any of their friends that they've broken up. the situation becomes a little bit more complicated, and they decide that they're going to continue acting as though they're a couple so that they can have this fantastic weekend, and by the end of it, they will finally come out with the truth. I would say this isn't my favorite of her books, but it definitely wasn't a disappointment either. Emily Henry's books are just always an enjoyable ride to me. Let me first say my favorite aspect of this book was the friendship group, because the main three girls were roommates in college and have been best friends ever since. That worked out really perfectly for my friend group, which I read this with, because Kat and I lived together for 3 years, and Allie was basically an unofficial roommate our senior year, so it was very hard not to draw similarities between these three and my friend group. Seeing their friendship really made me reminisce on my time in college and all of the trips I've taken with my best friends, and now I'm very excited for July to get here so that I can see them again. Henry's atmosphere work was fantastic. This definitely took me on vacation with them in Maine. I love that all three of these women knew each other so well, but also their significant others, which had become a part of the group, did too. They were all there for each other, and something I really liked with this is that the third act conflict isn't really in relation to the romance so much as it's about the friendship, actually. The friendship element, my absolute favorite. I did feel a bit called out by Harriet's internal struggles throughout the story. The introspection she does in this book is phenomenal. I felt called out by it, but I also felt comforted by it. It was a weird experience. I think that's something that's definitely a strength with Emily Henry's work, though, is she's able to put such deep and personal emotions into words that a lot of people can relate or have experienced in their lives. Harriet is really struggling with her identity, with her job, and with her ability to try and please everybody in her life. And damn, if that didn't all punch me square in the chest. Now, this is a romance book, so I have to talk about the romance. It's second chance with a little bit of fake dating, and thankfully the fake dating didn't really ever get obnoxious to me, because that tends to happen with that trope quite often in my experience. In regard to second chance romance, I do think Henry did a good job of balancing between convincing me of why they broke up in the first place, but not making it something so serious that I couldn't see them getting back together. Even with that though, the miscommunication in this book is a lot. It wasn't bad enough that I was throwing the book across the room, but I was definitely getting irked by it the more it happened. Apart from that though, I have to say, I just wasn't really sold on Win as a hero. In my opinion, I actually think he was the least developed character in the entire book. I think he and Harriet had fantastic banter. There was definitely some solid sexual tension going on throughout the story, but ignoring their relationship, I felt like he himself just fell kind of flat. I do think that got better at the end of the book when we finally started to dive into their issues, but I wish we had seen a little bit more of him throughout the story so I could have had a better feel on his character, and I think that may have helped me be more invested in the romance. So currently, in regards to rankings, I think I liked this more than People We Meet on Vacation, but less than Book Lovers, and definitely less than Beach Read. So for rating, this came out to 4 stars. Alright, next up I read Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars by cheng, thom, and I read this for Trans Girl April. I really enjoyed this one. This is a fictional memoir in which we are following a unnamed protagonist who is a trans Asian girl. She ends up running away from home and joining this gang of other trans women. Eventually, they decide to start fighting back against all of the transphobes in their neighborhood, and then we follow the events off of that. It's wild, it's weird, but it's beautiful. It's got some magical realism elements going throughout the story, which I wasn't really expecting whenever we start out and everything seems very normal. The writing itself almost feels like a surreal dream, but at the same time it is filled with so many nightmarish elements that trans women often experience. There were some ongoing motifs in the story because it is not told in a traditional linear timeline. There are little excerpts where it's almost like a diary entry. We have portions where it's nearly a perspective revolving around the main character's pocket knife. There's just so much good in the story as well as we watch our main character transforming into the person she wants to be as she finds a family for herself, as she finds strength and happiness in both that family and in herself and her identity. Though the story is very beautiful, there is a large focus on violence in it, and the almost odd comfort that the narrator finds in that violence. The healing and development that she goes through throughout the story in these fantastical ways all kept me incredibly invested. Every relationship she has with all of the different characters in the story impact her, and we're able to see that and understand how all of that comes together to create the final version of her at the end. Across the board, this book was pretty freaking beautiful. My only real criticism is that it is really short, and I just wish that some of the topics that were brought up were expanded upon a little bit more. Since the book is so short and there was so much talked about, I think some of those were a little bit too rushed, or they didn't have the time to breathe. But even with that, I really enjoyed this book, and my final rating came out to 4.5 stars. Finally, this book I don't actually have a rating for, because it would feel really weird to rate this book. And honestly, I don't know how this review is gonna go either, because I didn't type anything up, which might be a mistake, but I'm still gonna give you my thoughts. I buddy read Crying in H-Mart by Michelle Zauner with 𝗖cie, Pretty Purple Polka Dots, and I'm so glad I finally got around to this. It is a memoir following Michelle Zauner, who is a musician, specifically talking about her relationship with her mother and the experiences she went through after her mother's cancer diagnosis and eventual death. I can't not talk about the fact that I adore how prevalent food is in this book. It was such an important part in Michelle and her mother's relationship. That is something I do myself. I relate food with a lot of different things in my life, moments, people, experiences. I just really loved seeing how often she connected food with the experiences she was living. This was definitely a very emotional read, and it did get me tearing up. I think Zauner did a phenomenal job of talking about the weird experience she has with grieving someone even prior to their death, in the way grieving somebody can really affect your relationships with everybody around them who is also impacted by it. Whenever she would talk about her relationship with her father or her relationship with her aunts, I really felt that all the more. I loved how she had such a strong relationship with her boyfriend and then eventual husband, and how he was constantly a presence in her life with that as well. She doesn't sugarcoat things. She definitely doesn't focus on just the happy memories she has with her mother. And by the end of this book, I really felt as though, honestly, this was a way for her to work through her grieving process. And she was kind enough to share this book so that other people can connect with it, can relate with it. And that's absolutely phenomenal. It's so personal, and that's kind of the biggest reason of why I don't really feel comfortable reading this. This was a great book, and I do highly recommend. That was a weird note to end on, but that's it for today. Thank you so much for coming to my channel, y'all. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. I have all my socials as well as a few ways you can support me linked in the description. I come out videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!